All right. So today's theme is going to be, what will you do when you come face to face with Goliath? And I'm going to use a verse to open this up. It's James, if you guys want to turn to James chapter 1, verse 12. And it says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." Now, I chose to open up with this verse because, as we all know, as children of God, the Bible doesn't promise that this world is going to be easy, that we're not going to go through trial, that we're not going to go through temptation. As children of God, we are going to experience these things. But something that the Lord has really been ministering to me recently is, it's not about the trial, it's not about the circumstance, it's what we choose to do in the midst of it. And so with that being said, I want to kind of give a testimony and experience that I went through that related to this. So some of you guys know a little bit about my testimony, but growing up, I experienced a lot of rejection. I experienced a lot of abandonment. So I was always worried about what people thought about me. And in this season of healing that I'm going through, the Lord has been taking and removing and taking and removing, and he's been definitely putting me out of my comfort zone. And a specific moment was in HCC. I'm in the HCC ministry, and in the beginning we were doing the club fair. And in the club fair, what we do is, we share about the club, we give out the flyers, we evangelize, we spread the gospel, we talk about Jesus. And, it was going well, and, as, person was walking by, I was asking them if they wanted to know more about the club, if they wanted to know more about having a relationship with Jesus. And as each person walked by, it was no after no after no after no. And in that moment, I started to feel waves. I started to feel the counterattack. And I started to, feel anxious. And the enemy started to put doubt in my mind. And in that moment, when I was anxious, when I was worried, I went to the bathroom and I started praying. I started talking to the Holy Spirit. And in that moment, I knew that I had a decision to make. Was I going to allow the enemy to lie to me, to put doubt into my mind, to stop me from fulfilling the purpose that God has for me? Or was I going to choose to trust God in the midst of what I was feeling? And was I going to allow him to continue to use me? And so, now I'm here. And, obviously, I chose to trust God. But there's, times when we go through trials and when we go through counterattacks and when we go through tribulations. And, sometimes it's really easy to focus on what we're going through instead of, really focusing on what God is calling us to do. So today I want to talk about the story of David and Goliath. If you guys could turn to 1 Samuel 17. You can start with 1. I'm going to kind of give like a brief overview. Verse 1. 1 Samuel 17:1. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief overview of the chapter so you guys can just follow along. But basically, so in verse 1 through verse 8, it talks about the setting of the battle. So it tells us how the Israelites were on one side, the Philistines were on the other, and Goliath was pretty much in front of the Philistines in the center. And going down through verse 8 through 10, it introduces Goliath. Now, what do we know about Goliath? Goliath is a giant, okay? It says in the word that he's 6 cubits. If we compare that to like human feet, it's like 9 to 11 feet. So at this moment, there's the Israelites, there's the Philistines, and then there's Goliath. And in verse 8 through 10, it talks about how Goliath is taunting the Israelites, how he's trying to discourage them, how he's trying to put fear into their minds. And in verse 11, it talks about how the Israelites were afraid. Because in this moment, the Israelites were not focusing on the spiritual, but they were looking at the physical. And so they allowed fear to consume them. So going down to verse 12, we are introduced to David. Now, who's David? David is the son of Jesse. He's the youngest of the 8 brothers, and he is known as the one who watches over the sheep. And so going down to verse 16, it talks about how Goliath was constantly, for 40 days and 40 nights, taunting the Israelites, trying to put fear into their minds. Because Goliath understood that if he put fear into their minds, if he could convince them in their minds that the battle was already over, and in the physical it was over. So going down to verse 17 through 23, here we can see Jesse, David's dad, commands him to bring some items for his brothers and to bring back news of what was happening. So David, goes down to the camp, and he hears Goliath mocking the Israelites, and he hears Goliath mocking God. And so I'm going to read verse 25. And it says, "So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give him his father's house, exemption of taxes in Israel.'" So in this moment here, we can see again, the Israelites are focused on the physical. They're looking at the reward that Saul has to offer. So not only are they in fear, but they're looking at what they can get out of it. So reading verse 26, it says, "Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" So in this verse, we can see that unlike the Israelites and Saul, David is focusing on honoring the heart of God. David was a man who was after God's heart. And because of that, he wanted to defend Israel. He wanted to defend the name of God. So going down to verse 28, in this verse, it talks about how David's older brother, Eliab, attacks him. And I was reading a few commentaries on why he does this. And the first reason is because to David's brothers, he wasn't really viewed as worthy. He was just, one, he was the youngest, and 2, he just took care of the sheep. So that's all they really thought of him. Secondly, his brother assumed that he came down to watch a fight, to cause trouble. And thirdly, Eliab thought that David was trying to provoke him to fight Goliath, because he was the oldest out of all the brothers, so it would have made sense for him to fight. And so in verse 29, instead of David allowing his brother's words to bring him down, he continues to stand firm on what God is calling him to do. He knows his focus. He knows that, he's doing this for God. So he's not allowing what others say to bring him down. And so going down to verse 32, it talks about how David tells Saul that he is going to fight Goliath. And like I said before, just like the Israelites were looking at the physical, so was Saul. So in that moment, when David told him that he was going to fight Goliath, let's look at what he says. He says, "And David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.'" Verse 33, "And Saul said to David, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth.'" So, as we can see here, Saul was doubting David. And he was like, "Man, you're a kid, you don't know what you're doing. There's no way you're going to defeat him." But in verse 34 through 37, David tells Saul, about his past experiences. And he talks about how when a lion or a bear took a sheep out of the flock, he would go after it and he would strike it. And God would deliver that animal into his hands. So David was able to have confidence, and David was able to know that since God had delivered him before, he knew that God would do it again. And so in verse 38 through 40, Um, Saul is trying to put an armor on David because he sees Goliath, he sees how big Goliath is, and Saul's perspective at this moment is if he's going to win, he needs to be prepared, but not in the spiritual, but in the physical. So Saul is trying to put this armor on David, but there's two issues with that, okay? One, Saul's armor physically didn't fit David, okay? Saul was bigger, so it wouldn't have fit him. And secondly, Saul was looking at this battle from a physical point of view, not from the spiritual. He was trying to gear David in the natural. But David refuses to take it because, one, it doesn't fit him, and two, David knows that this is spiritual, not physical. And so, David's ready. He's going down to the brook. He grabs the 5 stones, and he's preparing to battle Goliath. And so, in verse 41 and 42, I'm going to read this. It says, "So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking." So as we can see, Goliath is also looking at the physical, okay? And he thinks that, because David is small and he's young, he's going to win the battle. So going down to verse 43, it says, "So the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come with me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods." So I was doing some research on this and reading text commentaries as well. And this is very, at this time, it was very insulting to call somebody a dog. He was really, really belittling him. And, again, just like he was trying to discourage the Israelites, he was also trying to discourage David. So going down to verse 44, sorry. It says, "And the Philistine said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field.'" So in this moment, Goliath is cursing David by his gods. And he's really just trying to put David down to discourage him. And he's thinking that he's going to win this battle. Then we go down to verse 45, and it says, "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with the sword, with the spear, and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defiled.'" And so in this moment, David's declaring that although Goliath has weapons, that David has God on his side. And because of that, this battle was already over. So going down to verse 46, it says, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." So something that I thought was really interesting about this is how David uses Goliath's own words against him. And, David tells Goliath that God is going to deliver him and that he's going to die. He declares that everybody is going to know that there is a God in Israel, because as we read, back in the beginning, the Israelites struggled to trust God because they were looking at things from the physical and not the spiritual. And so going into verse 47, it says, "Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." So in this verse, David is establishing authority. And he's saying that he doesn't need weapons to win. And he also establishes that this battle is not between, this is not between him and Goliath. The battle is between Goliath and the Lord. And because of that, God has the victory, because the battle is the Lord's. So going to verse 48 and 49, it says, "So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that the champion was dead, they fled. So this really stood out to me for two reasons. One, David didn't wait for Goliath to come after him. He ran after Goliath. Secondly, he used Goliath's own weapon against him. So, with that being said, what are some things that we can learn from the story of David and Goliath? Well, so my point one, what we can learn about this is don't look at your trials and circumstances from the physical, but from the spiritual. David was able to be confident and win because he knew that the battle between him and Goliath was spiritual and not physical. So although, Goliath tried to discourage him, he was still able to be confident. Unlike Saul and the other Israelites who were looking at the natural. David knew that since God was on his side, he would not be defeated. And, just like, when we go through trials and we go through circumstances, it's really important that we look at things from the spiritual. Because there's many times, when we look at the physical and, we're doing what God is calling us to do, counterattack comes. And sometimes when we get so wrapped up in the counterattack and what's happening around us, we tend to lose sight on what really matters. And so how are you able to, look at your circumstances and your trials from the spiritual and not the physical? Well, point one. Spend time with God in the secret place. Okay? This is really, really important. We talk about this a lot during Reborn Weekend. But, when you spend time with God in the secret place, that's where he's able to minister to you. He talks to you. And this is where you grow in your relationship with God. This is where you allowed him to build your confidence and minister to you. God had been preparing David from when he was tending the sheep. David spent a lot of time in communion with God. And through that, he's able to be confident to what God is calling him to do. Now, while we're in the secret place, something really important that we should ask God to do, which is point 1.2, ask God to open your spiritual eyes. As Matthew 7 verse 7 says, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. As we read in verse 16, Goliath's tactics from the beginning was to put fear into the minds of the Israelites. Because he knew that if he could convince them that the battle was already lost in their minds, that it would be over in the physical. Now, the enemy does this to us as well as children of God. He tries to constantly put doubt and fear into our hearts and minds so that we don't fulfill the role that God is calling us to. It's kind of like how I said earlier, how I shared about my experience at HCC. How God was calling me to evangelize and to minister. And in that moment, the enemy tried to come and put fear into my heart and into my mind so that I wouldn't have continued doing what God was asking me to do. But just like David was able to conquer because he looked beyond the physical and into the spiritual because he knew that God was fighting on our behalf. As children of God, we're able to do the same thing and we're able to have the same confidence. And with that being said, point 2 is have confidence and remember who your God is. David had confidence in the Lord because God had delivered him before. He was able to look back at his past experiences and be confident. David knew that God was his deliverer. Like he said before, when a lion or a bear, tried to get the sheep, he would strike it and God delivered it into his hand. He's able to look back at these past experiences and he's able to understand that because God had delivered him before, he would do it again. And he also knew that God was victorious. David knew that with God, he would not be defeated. And because of that, he was able to stand up in authority. So point 2.1, remember where God has taken you from. David had confidence in who God was and knew that with God he wouldn't be defeated because as he said in verse 34, God had delivered him before. And he knew that he would do it again. So, because, he knew who God was and he had this confidence, point 3, he was able to stand up in authority. David didn't allow fear to consume him because he knew that God was on his side. And we're able to have the same confidence and we're able to stand up in authority against the enemy when he tries to come with his counterattacks because through Christ we have the Holy Spirit, which gives us the authority. But something that's really important to understand when we're going through battles, when we're going through trials, when we're going through tribulations, is that the battle is not ours, it's the Lord's. Just like David was able to understand this. It is not by your own strength. In verse 47, David says he will give you into our hands. David recognizes that he's not the one who has the power to defeat Goliath. A lot of times when we go through trials, at least I know I can speak for me, we try to take control and we try to come up with a plan and we try to figure everything out. But in all reality, that just puts us in a deeper hole. But the moment that we step back and we realize that God's in control, we're able to have peace because we're able to understand that He's the one fighting for us. So yeah, with that being said, there's times that, we go through the battle, we go through the trials, and it's really, really, really easy to focus on the physical. It's really, really easy to focus on what's happening around us. But it's so, so important that we look at things from the spiritual. It's important to remember, who God is, where He's taken us from. I know in that moment, when I was in the bathroom in HEC, and those thoughts were coming, doubt was coming, I was able to look back and remember to this specific moment where I was really down, I was really low. And I was able to remember how God had delivered me from it and how He's helping me grow, He's helping me move forward. And I knew that because He took me out of that place that I was in, that dark place. He took me out of addiction. He took me out of depression. He took me out of anxiety. That no matter what the enemy was going to try to throw my way, I knew that with Him I would be able to conquer it. I constantly spent time with the Lord, allowing Him to minister to me. And, I had to come to a moment where I realized that this battle was not with me, it was with the Lord, and that the Lord was fighting for me. And so I was able to stand up in authority. So now, my question to you is, what is a Goliath that you're facing in your life? And what are you going to do in the midst of it?
What is your Goliath right now? What is it that you're facing right now that that is hindering you from growing in your relationship with Jesus? Everybody, bow your heads, close your eyes. I want you all to think of two things, one or two things that you're dealing with. It could be in your mind, it could be in your heart, it could be in your relationships, it could be at your job, it could be in your marriage, your relationship with your family, with your friends. It could be doubt, it could be insecurity, it could be sexual impurity, it could be anything that is holding you back from breaking through in your intimacy with the Holy Spirit, from breaking through in your ministry. What is your Goliath right now? As Carmen said, so much of our lives does not have to do with the physical, but has to do with the spiritual. Satan has been talking to some of you, saying that you have maxed out in your relationship with Jesus. There is no more for you. You've hit the end of the road. There is no more growth left for you. There is no more room for you to prosper with your relationship with Jesus.